Good evening and welcome back. Woke Nation is back in the saddle again. Um, Tonight I want to talk about uh, a story that kind of broke a little while ago. Man, I always hit the camera. Always. But this broke a little while ago, and actually I became aware of it because my wife watches I think it's the reality show called Outdaughtered, about the Busbys, and they had five daughters, like she had quintuplets. Um, but anyway, her husband, whose name I can't remember right now, and I watch it almost every morning for like 10 minutes while I'm drinking my coffee and about to go to work. It's actually not a bad show for what it is. Um, but anyway, he was suffering from depression, and they kind of figured out that it was this kind of like postpartum depression. I guess they usually women get, but the Busby father, whose name I just can't remember right now. What is his name? I don't know. A lot of people are probably yelling at me right now, including my wife, for not remembering. But anyway, so he was going through this long period of depression and anxiety and just kind of withdrawing into himself and not communicating. There is this kind of isolation going on between him and his wife and the kids. They have six daughters, five quintuplets, and then a daughter Blake, who's a little bit older. Anyway, so this was starting to take a toll on their relationship, and clearly he wasn't happy, but when they would communicate about it, he couldn't pinpoint why he wasn't happy. He couldn't pinpoint what was causing it, and yeah, he seemed pretty helpless, and devoid of any real answers to combat this just increasing darkness and anxiety and depression. It's basically what it was, depression that was enveloping him. And so later on, a couple episodes later, they meet up with a pastor, whose name I know it's Jared Wilson. I'm just trying to get to the top of this article here from NBC News. But yeah, so this pastor who wasn't even 30 years old at the time, I think, that they taped and recorded the episode. But he goes to Nashville, I think, Tennessee, and meets with this guy, Jared Wilson, who's a pastor of a megachurch, actually out in California. So what he was doing in Nashville, I'm not so sure about. And the Busbys live in Texas, so it's kind of unusual, but hey, I don't know the details. But anyway, so not important. He goes and meets Jared Wilson, and they're talking, and Jared Wilson, he's this pastor of this mega church. I think his father was the pastor before him, so he kind of passed the baton there, and he took over the reins as some sort of senior or associate pastor or something. And they start talking, and this is being recorded, it's filmed, you can watch it in the episode, and he's just very open about his own personal battles with depression and anxiety, and sort of the same feeling that the Busby father, the nameless one, was going through, and just this kind of isolation and where it's almost like they both seemed in agreement that they were helpless against it, that this was going on regardless of everything that they were attempting to do to combat it. And I don't know the Busbys' personal faith. I know they go to church. It's mentioned briefly in the background that they go to church and everything, so I don't know much about how what the depth of their faith or their religion is in their personal life. But I know that Jared Wilson, obviously, he's a pastor, and he had founded organizations to help people who were struggling with depression and suicidal tendencies and anxiety and substance abuse, which is great. So long story short, not too long after that episode was broadcast, Jared Wilson tragically committed suicide. and I'm not aware. I didn't look into really how he did it. I don't care. I mean, not to be callous, but it's just not important. But this, and he was a young guy, married with children. So I mean, it's really tragic and sad. Um, and there was not too long before that, a couple years ago, and I don't have the name in front of me, another pastor who also was, married, had kids, and was heading a kind of mental health organization just like Jared Wilson, and had struggled with depression, also took his own life. So there are two pastors right there, very young, uh, the heads of megachurches, who committed suicide. And according to this article here on NBC, there's also Gregory Eels, Eells, who is, if I can get to it here, he was head of counseling and psychological services at University of Pennsylvania. So he also took his own life. Now, this is a person who was secular. Um, I have to admit, the sometimes I have kind of a cartoonish view of the world, where I fall into the habit of trying to compartmentalize people and belief systems too much, and this really kind of blew that, set that kind of spinning out into the void when Jared Wilson did this. Only because I talk so much on this show about how secularism and atheism and all these things really leave you devoid of meaning and hopeless, and ultimately at the bottom, the root bottom of it, it's a hopeless worldview and a pointless one. And so, not that I wish it on anybody, but I see like depression and suicidal tendency very, very closely linked, with secularism, inevitably. And I mean, I was listening to a podcast by Allie Beth Stuckey, who I really like, and I would recommend. Her show is called Relatable. And she was talking about that today, about this rise in the secularization of the millennial generation, the nuns, as they call them, those who profess no religious affiliation whatsoever. They're not even nominally Christian, entirely secular. And there's a correlation, a link between that and the rise in suicide. She draws the link, and I would agree with her. But this kind of compartmentalization that I do is I don't. So I would put everybody in the secular world in a box and say, it makes sense. Not that I'm happy about it. In fact, it's sad, but it makes sense that they would struggle with these things. But over here, the Christians, they really shouldn't, because they have Christ, they have God, they have hope, they see the meaning in life. As the Catechism says, what is the chief end of man? To glorify God and enjoy Him forever. So if that is your goal, if that is what is driving you, and you're honest about it and genuine and sincere, then it didn't seem, it just didn't enter my thoughts that suicide could be in any way would ever enter that realm. And I'm not saying that I don't think that people would struggle or any of these things, or that could never happen. But I think that, certainly, it's easy to get wrapped up in looking at people as groups, don't we know it in America today, and saying that, well, you believe this and you believe that, and because you believe this makes sense for you, and because you believe that over there, that makes sense for you, and never shall the twain meet. That doesn't make any sense. But you get what I'm saying. It's very easy to compartmentalize people. We call it tribalism. You hear about it all the time in the news, how the progressive left is a tribalist. They just judge everybody by groups. But I think it's very easy for anybody to do that in today's society. And this whole issue with depression and suicide, I was guilty of it. It kind of made me realize that things aren't really as simple as they may sound, or as they may seem. There was a tweet that Jared Wilson, if I can get to it here, bear with me, that he tweeted out not long before he passed away. if I can get to it here. Let me see. Yeah, this is an abbreviated version of his tweet, not the entire thing, but it gives you a general idea. It says, shortly before his death, Jared Wilson tweeted, quote, loving Jesus doesn't always cure suicidal thoughts. Loving Jesus doesn't always cure depression, but that doesn't mean Jesus doesn't offer us companionship and comfort. So, yeah, and I remember when I read that tweet, I was, taken aback by it, and I really had to digest it and think about it for a minute, because it challenged the sort of this compartmentalization that I had been guilty of, I think, for a little while now. It's very easy, as I said, to do it, and I'm not trying to point the finger at anybody else. I did it. But, when you're doing a podcast, and not that I'm using this as an excuse, but when you do a podcast and you're just thinking of ideas and ideologies and belief systems and values, and if you believe this, what's the logical end result of thinking that, or of living that out? What's the toll that's going to take on your life? Is it negative? Is it positive? Is it going to benefit you? But the reality is that even those who are Christian, obviously, there are shades of gray throughout life, and I think Jared Wilson was, in a very sad way, showed us just how real that actually is, that gray area, which isn't to say I don't think he was a Christian at all. I know nothing about his personal spiritual life. I know he was a pastor of a mega church. There's, out of respect for him, I'm not going to really go into some of my personal opinions on megachurches. I've talked about them in previous episodes. And so I don't feel like it's necessary here. Whether that had an effect on well, I will say one thing, is that there is an increasing trend. And again, I'm not trying to compartmentalize, I'm trying to learn my lesson about that. But there is an increasing trend within the church that to over emotionalize things, in the sense of, and I'll use myself as an example. I would hear these just faith and living out your faith talked in a very emotional ways, that coupled with some of the more strict and rigid Calvinistic doctrinal churches that were more closed off, I would say, from society, and more inward looking than outward, and evangelistic, more closed off. There was a bit of that, quite a bit of that I struggled with myself. This idea that unless you're experiencing something in an emotional sense, then it's not real. And that's because in a lot of ways, I think our culture has taught us that just to think in emotional mannerisms, to only think emotionally. Everything we do is based off of how we feel. There's not a whole lot of objective, real thought anymore. It's just more, let's react to how this feels. Our worship has taken that on in a lot of churches. That's a genuine frustration I've been having lately, in finding an actual church that preaches doctrine, that might actually have a sermon one day that's a series that just is a study on who God is. I don't hear that anymore. I don't hear anything about free will or actual, like, original sin or propitiation, or none of these words are in the sermons, or these technical terms, which actually is just actual genuine doctrine. You just don't hear it anymore. Everything is just your emotional response to God, the loving teddy bear in the sky, and at the end of every hymn, or not hymn, but repetitive praise and worship song, everybody claps. Let's give the Lord a hand. I'm not making that up. That's a church right here in Mechanicsburg that does exactly that, and some of the other churches that we visited do exactly that. And I don't think those are anomalies. I think that's pretty fairly widespread in a lot of the bigger mega church contemporary worship services, and it's largely because we've lost like any real sense of the holiness of God, and the how set apart we are from Him. Um, and if you lose sight of that, what the Bible calls the fear of the Lord, which is a healthy thing, really, because it's an awareness that He's holy and we are not. If you lose sight of that, then you can't expect to have a real meaningful worship service, because then it becomes all about you. And that's where I want to tie into not Jared Wilson specifically, but myself and maybe some other people who have struggled with like thinking of their spiritual walk in terms of emotion. And struggling because they don't feel like they're walking with God, and I mean that specifically, feel like you're walking with God. I don't know if Jared Wilson was struggling with something like that. I only know that mega churches emphasize emotion, by and large. Maybe not his. Maybe his was, maybe he was in the middle of a sermon series on the attributes of God, and he read Luther and Calvin every single day and was the most doctrinally reformed person on the face of the planet. I have no idea. I'm not trying to make judgments or assumptions about Jared Wilson or the other pastor I mentioned. I would assume only the best about them. But I only say that myself is it's easy to, and others I know that struggle with this, because in the culture we're just so obsessed with, number one, how we personally relate to things. So something isn't real unless, or isn't genuine unless you feel yourself relating. How do you feel in relation to something? And that's what our worship has become. How do you feel in relation to the Lord? Well, worship isn't about that at all. It's about worshiping God in spirit and truth. And to do that, you go into the Bible and see how did God command people to worship Him in the past. And very quickly you see in the Old Testament specifically, there is no sort of talk about how do you feel in relation to the Lord. There's just none of that. In fact, there's almost no talk that I can think of from Jesus or Paul or anywhere where it emphasizes emotion or how you feel or how you respond emotionally in relation to your relationship with God. And yet we seem to have infused that into a lot of our conversation, in preaching, in the books we read, the spiritual books. The Purpose-Driven Life is a perfect example. That was a book that actually helped me a little bit. Well, not a little bit. It helped me quite a bit a year or so ago when I was really struggling about this whole meaning of life thing. And out of nowhere, I was just driving one day, and the catechism popped into my head, just literally out of nowhere. What is man's chief end? To glorify God and enjoy Him forever. And I realized, this isn't about me. None of this is about me, because I used to be so obsessed and worried about, I didn't want to just be a statistic. I didn't want to just die and not have any meaning or any value or not have accomplished anything. I was painting or as a cable tech, as I am now. And I would just think of these things, well, these are meaningless jobs. If I died tomorrow, by and large, nobody would know that I was ever here. And so like that consumed my thoughts, and then that just popped into my head one day out of nowhere when I was just kind of praying and struggling over this. That none of this is about you specifically in a large way. It's not. It is in the sense that God loves you and He sent His Son to die on the cross. That whoever should believe on Him, whoever has been chosen to be believing on Him, as the original Greek says in John 3:16. But this world and what's going on in it is not about you. It's not about me. And in the culture today, people can't accept that. We're told that you are the most important thing, that the world revolves around you. and the world revolves around me, and we're the autonomous rulers of our world, and whoever we are is who we should be. Moral improvements should go out the window and just have no effect. Ignore them. Whoever you are at your bottom, in your root heart, is what you should live out. Proclivities, orientations, desires, embrace it all. And that's going to have a very damaging effect on self-esteem, because the Bible says that God has put a conscience, he's written his law in our hearts. And so when you're embracing proclivities and inclinations and orientations and desires that run contrary to the conscience that God has put within you, you're going to, there's going to be a lot of anxiety. There's going to be trauma. There's going to be, a lot of psychological pain and torment as your conscience is tormented, knowing deep down that you're doing something horrific and sinning against God. That's something we don't talk about ever, is sin. But yet we downplay that. We ignore it. We push it down in this embracement of ourself. And a lot of that is, the only way to really do that is to get back to what we were talking about just a minute ago, is through emotional thinking. You can't do that logically. You can't do that rationally, because everything about rational reality screams against many of the things that we embrace today: homosexuality, pedophilia, transgenderism, almost every progressive liberal ideological belief that we have today is our rational thinking screams against it. Our moral inside, our moral conscience screams against it. The law of God that's written on our hearts screams against it. So the only way to really embrace it and to live that out is to shut that side of yourself down, to suppress it, and think emotionally, respond emotionally. Emotion is a very deceptive thing, and that's why, getting back to kind of the depression aspect of it, again, for myself, I know that when you think in terms of emotion constantly, it can lead to a lot of doubt. That's what it did for me. So with Jared Wilson, I can understand kind of where he was coming from in a lot of ways. I don't, again, know him personally, but just what he says, loving Jesus doesn't always cure suicidal thoughts. And, that really made me start thinking outside the box, that these problems, these issues aren't quite as simple as we all make them sound. And the fix for them isn't quite as simple as you would think either, because again, going back to me, I went through a long period of doubt and depression and really intense anxiety, and just this one counselor I spoke to called it existential angst, and which I guess is a good way to describe it. But it's just this constant gnawing sense that my faith or what I believe just isn't genuine, because I don't experience it emotionally all the time. That was what, for some reason, I was just so obsessed with that. I thought that was like the litmus standard for everything, was just emotion. And if you weren't experiencing tremendous sadness because you just sinned, or then you're not genuinely repented. Or if you're not experiencing salvation in the sense of like Paul on the road to Tarsus, then you're not truly saved. And so there was no assurance, by and large, in my life. And again, that's just because, rather than trusting God and trusting what he said in the Bible, I was choosing to think about things from my own standard, which was an emotional one. I had it in my head that this is the standard for what it would look like or feel like or be like to be a Christian. And, my standard doesn't matter. It's God's standard that actually matters. Again, I'm not trying to infer in any way that Jared Wilson was doing anything that I'm talking about, whether he was just thinking emotionally about things. I'm not accusing of him of that in the least. I'm just saying that I think that when you look around the churches today, you can kind of see the little the fruits of that type of thinking springing up here and there. You can see it in the worship, this obsession with emotion and how you respond in worship, how you feel in worship. And as Allie Beth Stuckey said in her podcast today, this obsession with self obviously is going to eventually lead to depression and suicide, because on our own we are not the end all be all. And when you keep thinking of only yourself and basically putting yourself on the throne in your heart, the place that Christ should take, then is it any wonder that you feel empty and like you don't have the answers, and meaningless and valueless, and like everything is pointless. Like you spend living that way just makes you go through life empty, because you can never satisfy yourself. You never will, because you are inadequate. As much as we like to tell ourselves today that you're perfect just the way you are. No, that's not true. And I don't say this to undercut anybody or to be harsh or anything, but there's a real beauty in our inadequacy because of what Christ did. It's like the pieces to a puzzle, the way they fit together. Our inadequacy is what made the cross necessary. And it was a very beautiful thing that God did in sending Christ. A really good book I would recommend is John Stott's The Cross of Christ, which goes into this in far greater detail than I ever could, from every angle you could possibly think of. So, yeah, I would recommend The Cross of Christ by John Stott. It's a phenomenal book. I'm just almost at the very end of it now. But he talks quite a bit about, the beauty of the cross is magnified in our inadequacy, that it wouldn't be as great and phenomenal and perfect as it was if we were not so horrendously imperfect. And that's not that we should go through life with this depressed feeling of tremendous lack of self-worth, like we're worthless. I mean, I realize the Bible, Paul talks about, my righteousness are as filthy rags, I'm the chief of all sinners. This is true. But that's he's not talking about himself in the sense of self-esteem. That's not what that's referring to, but it's rather just referring to our inadequacy in relation to God. But the real beauty of it is that we have value, and you have value because for no other reason than that God loved you, Christ died for you. It says that when we were still sinners, when we were enemies of God, he died for us. That tells you all you need to know about your value, that you have tremendous value. So if you didn't, then he would have left the world to its own devices and therefore its own damnation, basically. Look what happened with Paul on the road to Tarsus. Paul was not searching for God. Paul was not seeking God. He was not on a spiritual journey in search of Christ. He was persecuting Christ. He was killing Christians and imprisoning them and doing everything he could to destroy the Church of Christ. And God, for no other reason that he had decided to love Paul. Basically, the word I always think to use is invaded. He invaded Paul's life. He knocked him off his horse and said, "Why are you persecuting me?" And Paul knew who it was immediately. He said, "Who are you, Lord?" Because the way I think of it is in that scenario. There was when God speaks to you directly, you know who it is. There's no wonderment. Is that Michael Jackson? No, it's God. You know it's God because it could be nobody else. There's an authority and as I said before, such a profound separation between us and him in majesty that if he does speak to you directly, you'll know it immediately. There will be no doubt. Um, but yeah, I mean, he could very easily have been justified in leaving Paul to his own devices, in as Paul later wrote in Romans chapter 1, turning himself over to his own sinful inclinations. God could have done that, and he would have been justified to do it. This, after all, was a man that was willingly, purposefully, intentionally, and planning out the destruction of the Christian church, taking glee in the stoning to death of Saint Stephen. He held the coats of the people that stoned Stephen to death in public, in broad daylight. No remorse, no mercy, no regret, a profound glee and thinking he was doing possessed of holy zeal. God could have left him to his own devices and been perfectly justified in doing it, in the same way that he could have done the same for me when I knew what was right, and yet I went off, for a good 10 years, doing a lot of things that deep down I knew I shouldn't do, and yet I did them anyway, freely, of my own choosing. And then by his own mercy, by his grace, which is unmerited favor, unmerited mercy, he chose to bring me out of that. He didn't have to. In fact, he would have been perfectly justified in just having me overdose or crash my car, as I came close to doing 50. But going back to Paul, as I said, Paul was not searching for Christ, and that's just, to me, that's the perfect example, the thing that we can all latch onto and hold on to and embrace and really use if any of us are lacking assurance. Like I said, I went through such a long period where assurance was just not in my playbook. It was not something that I really could hang on to or hold on to for any real length of time. So I just think that, especially with just the sheer prevalence of this of what's obviously a very real problem in the church, if you have two pastors that have passed away by their own hand, and then these mental health professionals also in the secular world, like Gregory Eels, and there's another lady that's listed here, Stacy Friedenthal, who thought about and struggled with suicidal thoughts. Just the sheer prevalence of this problem. As I said a few minutes ago, we got to start thinking of it. I have to start thinking of it if we're going to, reach people and help people and help ourselves as something beyond these compartmentalized ideologies and theologies and whatever. It's very obviously something that goes far beyond any sort of compartmentalization that I would do or anyone would do. It's cross-cultural. It's secular, Christian. It's something that we can all struggle with. Obviously, I've struggled with it in the past. I just, by the grace of God, once I realized that that the world and everything in it didn't revolve around me. Once I realized that, and you would think to yourself, well, maybe that to some people that would be a depressing thought. Well, to me, it was actually a huge sigh of relief. That this wasn't all about me. That really the purpose of life it wasn't for me to go out and make a name for myself in the eyes of the world. That was a huge relief when I realized that that's not what this was all about. That really, ultimately, what it's about is pleasing God, and evangelization and working towards the coming kingdom when Christ returns. And that's that's another topic for another podcast, and I want to wrap things up here, but just to emphasize it, when you focus on the idea that this isn't all about you, it really, to me, was a huge relief. And I think it could, really help a lot of people to just realize that they don't have to control things. It's not about controlling things. It's not about um, being the richest guy or the most handsome, dashing Hugh Hefner, Charlie Sheen playboy out there. A lot of that just leads to sheer emptiness. Pleasure never fills the hole in your heart. um, and making a name for yourself, as a which is just the drive today. This celebrity driven culture, where anybody can create a podcast like me, anybody can create a YouTube channel like me, and anybody can do these things, and really it just uh, get their 15 minutes of fame and then get this emotional high from it. But then once it's gone, you're left with yourself again. Always at the end of the day, you're left with yourself. And on our own, we're not adequate. And that's not a negative picture, really. On the surface, you might think it is, but it isn't. Really, the beauty of it is that Christ redeems our inadequacy. We're not left to ourselves. He had a plan, he had a purpose, and part of that's what we talk about with sanctification, with regeneration. Christ and God are renewing all things. And he says, "Behold, I make all things new." That includes you. That includes me. He Christ was the suffering servant. He came here and suffered alongside each and every single one of us, in a sense. Um, and that's what he did on the cross. He suffered. There was no pain that we feel in this world that he didn't experience in its fullness. So you can take a lot of comfort in that. In your darkest hour, just remember that Christ is there with you in your darkest hour, and he thought of you in his darkest hour on the cross. There is that human element to him. He was fully God and fully man, so he experienced these very human pains and emotions, not in the same sense that we do, but in a very real sense at the same time. And that's a complex topic, how he experienced things. And I don't fully understand all of it, and I don't pretend to, but that's certainly something you can take very real comfort in. Anyway, I'm going to wrap it up there. And just keep in mind that the emotional way of thinking that we're so often sucked into today can be very powerful and very alluring, but it's not reality. It's not real. What is real is what is the revelation that God has revealed in the Bible, in the general revelation in nature, and what he's told us about himself in the Bible. That's what you can hang on to. What Christ did, how he suffered for you and I. That's what you can hold on to in your darkest hour, that in his darkest hour, he thought of you. Anyway, good night and God be with you.